Okay, well, thank you very much for coming to Google Developer Day. We really appreciate it. My name is Jeremy Allison. I work in the Mountain View office. I've been with Google since January of this year. As I mentioned earlier, if you may have missed me talking about the presentation at the beginning, unfortunately, being A, English, and B, living in the US, I have never learned any other languages, so I'm very sorry this is going to have to be an English presentation. But if people would like and feel more comfortable about asking questions in German, I'm sure we can get someone to translate so that I can actually understand what you're asking me. The other thing is, please feel free to... I know we have a question and answer period at the end, but sometimes people, if I might say something that people disagree with, or they think I'm an idiot or something, and you'd like to put your hand up and ask a question, please feel free to do that during the talk. If you do want to ask a question, though, it would be very helpful for the recording people if you could go to the mic at the back so that people will be able to hear you. So, who am I and why am I here and talking to you about open source at Google? Well, I've been doing open source software for a very long time, before there was such a term as open source. Started at Google in January. I'm probably best known for being one of the co-authors of Samba, which is an open source file and print project that is pretty widely used. If you're using Windows and you double-click on a network neighborhood, there's a strong likelihood that some of the servers that you see in your organization are probably Samba servers, even though you might not know them as such. And I have probably the world's strangest job at Google, because essentially I don't really work on any Google code. I tend to work on Samba-Code for the most part, and I also help other companies use and incorporate the Samba-Code in other projects. And I also come and give talks like this, and I work with Chris in the Open Source Programs Office, which is a very different kind of organization to most open source review offices and review boards that many companies have. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. So a few of the things we do are license compliance, both incoming and outgoing, for source code. We release code. We have a team who runs the Summer of Code program. And we also advise on doing protocol and API licensing for Google. And I'm also, as I mentioned, I'm a long-time free software advocate. And I have a little archive of columns that I do called The Low Point, The View from the Valley, which is the Silicon Valley, which are available online if you're bored and want to read anything. So I'm going to start with a little review of Google. I don't know whether you've seen these things before. These slides are actually Chris's slides. They're a variant of the talk that he's going to be giving, or may already have given, in London. So that means any spelling mistakes or strange mistakes on the slides, I can claim that it's his fault and not mine. So this is actually a picture of the very first Google cluster in Stanford. I was actually in the Valley at the time, but not working at Stanford. And it's actually a bunch of Sun and IBM and various PCs scrounged from departments in Stanford University. And it's actually running a mixture of systems. So it's running Solaris, it's running Linux. I think there's some AIX in there. So this is an interesting thing about Google, is that Google has always been cross-platform. It's never really been a monoculture. So making the software portable and running on lots of different systems has always been part of the Google DNA. So this is a close-up picture of one of the early Google racks. And if you ever get the opportunity to visit the Mountain View campus, there's actually one of these racks available to be viewed in one of the reception areas. They don't turn it on, of course, because it's a fire hazard. So interestingly enough, this shows how frugal Google was in the early days with the hardware. Apparently the reason for this is that data centers at the time, probably still are, were charging by the square meter. So the more machines Google engineers could cram into a square meter, the cheaper their costs were. So underneath these CPU boards, underneath these motherboards, are in fact there's a layer of cork so that they don't short out when put on the top of the metal racks. The disk drives are essentially duct taped on top of the memory, I think. And as you may guess, there were probably a lot of hardware failures in this. It was using the cheapest possible IDE-style drives. There's a lot of hardware failures you get in an environment like this. So this is something quite interesting about Google, is that they've always used the cheapest possible hardware, commodity hardware. And the way that they make it work is the software. The software has to be intelligent. Essentially, hardware sucks and will break. The software has to be intelligent and to cope with failure. And so this is an interesting way of attacking the problem. So this is, I think, a few years later, getting somewhat better. You can still see that they have a $10 fan there acting as a cooling mechanism. But you can see at least the cables do seem to be tied up a little better, although you can see some of the power strips there. It's not a great resolution photograph. Moving on, I think this is, I'm not exactly sure when this is, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. Apparently, this whole cage was filled up by Google install people in less than 4 hours. So going from a blank space to this miniature data center took about less than 4 hours. So they were getting really, really good at this stuff. And here's the latest picture that they let people see, which is not very. You've got some strange glowing green eyes in the background there. And Google has a lot of computers now. And I think the hardware is somewhat better designed. But it still fails. It still really sucks. And the magic to make it all work is in the software, which is a very interesting approach. Essentially, using commodity PCs, Chris actually asked me to thank everybody for buying the cheapest possible PCs, because essentially it's commoditized everything and driven all the prices down. And Google takes full advantage of that. So what I'm actually going to be talking about. So here's a question for the audience. Who here uses Linux? Okay. The people who have your hands down, do you do Google web searches? Yeah? Okay. You're also using Linux. Because the thing you have to understand is that every time you do a Google search or you use any of the Google applications, all of the back-end infrastructure is built almost entirely on top of free software. So Google is a massive consumer and producer of free software, of open source software. I mean, we're using Python, all sorts of web applications. So the free software ecosystem and environment, open source, is incredibly important to Google. And so that really is what the rest of the talk is about. How we use free software, why we use free software, because it's not immediately apparent. Essentially, Google does have the resources to say, right, that's it, we're going to write Google OS and do things from scratch, but we don't do that. And likewise, there are many other things that we choose not to do. And this is one of the things that makes Google a really great place to work if you're interested in open source or free software. And it's a very, very friendly place for that. Now, I'll try and give you some idea of the sense of that. So here's a wonderful quote from a friend of Greg Stein's who works also in the Open Source Program Office. A license can ruin a perfectly good piece of software. So I don't know how many people here have actually read an open source license or free software license. Ah, boy, people with far too much time on their hands. So, I mean, personally, I find them very interesting, but that's kind of the area I'm interested in. But licenses are very, very important with open source software. Licenses convey intent, and they really do. Many of the licenses have a history behind them. So a couple of the oldest are the BSD license from Berkeley, the Berkeley Software Distribution, and then the GNU GPL, which is a recursive algorithm for a license. So originally, there was the BSD license, which was produced by Berkeley, and the first of the really free software licenses, the reciprocal licenses, was created by Richard Stallman at MIT. And the reasons behind this are very, very interesting. I first came across this license before I even moved to the US, back when I was living in England. And it's a very interesting document to read, some of the first free software, the first GNU GPL licenses. And essentially, he had a problem in that he was working in the artificial intelligence lab, and he ran across a piece of hardware, a printer that jammed every so often. This is a very famous story. You can search for it if you want to hear it told in his words. But essentially, he wanted to fix that problem, as he had with many other printers before, and the person who had this new spiffy laser printer refused to give him a copy of the driver software and said, well, I've had to sign a non-disclosure agreement in order to get a copy of this. And Richard was completely outraged, and so decided to make such a thing impossible. And the way he chose to do it was to essentially decide to write his own POSIX and UNIX-compatible operating system from scratch and replace all the proprietary stuff. And so the amazing, essentially the amazing arrogance of that wish just shows how forceful and how strongly Richard believes in the free software movement and free software licenses. And once you understand that, many, many other things start to make sense. And many people agree with him. I mean, I am personally a very, very big fan of the GNU GPL. I prefer to use it for all of the software that I create. One of the nice things about Google is that we are very license agnostic, essentially. An engineer creating software, if they want to release it as free software, they do get to choose the license that they give it away under. There are reasons for choosing various different licenses. But the GNU GPL is incredibly popular. 50% of all free, so FOSS or FLOSS, free and libre open source software, is a very common acronym we use. 50% of all free software, open source software, is under the GNU GPL. And Google and Samba, my own project, have also been involved in the drafting and review process for the third version of the license, the GPL version 3. And we're extremely supportive of it. So basically, if you understand the fundamentals of where Richard's coming from, the GNU GPL makes a lot more sense. So where did the term open source come from? Well, actually, it was a marketing exercise, a rebranding exercise, done by Tim O'Reilly, the publisher of the O'Reilly books, Eric Raymond, who'd recently written The Cathedral and the Bazaar, and they saw a problem, and a few others. I think I was working at VA Linux at the time, so Larry Augustine, my boss, was there. Free was a problem because in English, free is a confusing term. It means both without cost, and it also means without restrictions. And business people like the without cost part, but they don't like the sort of without restrictions, because business is all about putting restrictions on things. And so they decided that to come up with a new term that would be more business-friendly, and actually came up with this term open source, which because free was too weird. Remember, this is the United States and sort of a very strange society where freedom is equated with evil communism or other such things. So they rebranded it, they remarketed it as open source, which sounded much more catchy, and started putting working out what open source actually meant and putting all these, categorizing all these licenses underneath that umbrella. So you have other licenses were appearing. BSD obviously is very old, I think, possibly older than the GNU GPL. So was MIT. But then there were newer licenses like the Apache license and the Mozilla license for the newly released Mozilla code. And for a while, it was sort of like the open source license of the week club. You know, some company would announce that they were releasing code and come up with their new license. Sun did one. And you know, to their credit, Google has never done anything like that. You know, HP is another company that decided that there were enough open source licenses, they were not going to create any of their own. So that was the history behind open source. So what actually is an open source license? Well, the idea is that it's any license that's approved by a small board of people, the Open Source Initiative, and complies with their definition, the open source definition, which you can happily read if you search for open source definition. It's the first hit. The problem is they didn't trademark it. So essentially, anybody can say, we are an open source company with an open source license that is very close to the GPL, but with a few restrictions. And essentially, it's not a very meaningful term, really. This is one of the reasons why Richard Stallman refused to go along with open source and stuck to his guns with free software. It's not well defined. Many firms will call themselves open because, hey, open is good, right? You know, open XML or whatever. But it's not really open. There are restrictions for patents. There are restrictions, you know, on use. There's no... You can't stop somebody calling something open source when it really isn't. And that's one of the problems. Too many licenses. There are 60 of them approved to date. And I used to work at HP on their open source review board, and one of our major headaches was essentially working out the matrix of what licenses were compatible with which. And it's a real headache. We have the same problem at Google. We have a very nice solution for it, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So misuse of the term and lots of scare tactics from various vendors around open source. So the intentions were extremely good. They were based on the Debian Linux distribution free software guidelines, and done originally, I think, by Bruce Perens. And it has no field of use restrictions, no royalties, save for the media costs. Obviously, the source code must be available for people to download. No discrimination. Just because you don't like, you know, software used for military use, you can't say that this must not be used for military use. Well, you can, but it's just not an open source license by definition then. Obviously, the code must be redistributable by people who obtain the code. But it's confusing. You couldn't really... It's well-intentioned, but it has a lot of confusing terms in it. One of the big ones is the license must not restrict other software is one of the terms to match the open source definition. But what does that mean? So, for instance, Apache, obviously, open source software, sits on port 80 on any machine it's running on. No other software can bind to port 80 while Apache is running. Is that restricting other software? You know, Samba binds to ports 139 and 445. No other SMB server can bind to those ports while Samba is running. Are we restricting other software? So these things like must be specific to a product, mustn't restrict to the software, must be technology neutral. They're not very meaningful terms, and they're not very well defined. So essentially, you have this somewhat confusing mix of licenses and definitions. But what you have to remember is it really is getting down to intent. So you can categorize the licenses into three main types, really, which are Apache, BSD, MIT-style license, which essentially are you can do anything you like so long as you didn't claim you wrote the software yourself. So you can incorporate it into proprietary code. You don't have to give anything back. You don't have to give out the source code. They're completely free for most uses of the term. Then you have the lesser GNU public license, the MPL and Sun's, I think it's CDDL, I think that's the Sun one. So essentially that says that the software that they're giving you under this license must remain free, but you can link and add other parts of software that don't have to remain free. So essentially there's a core part of the software that if you modify directly, you must make available and you must redistribute the source code, but you can add other pieces that you can keep closed. So that's kind of a hybrid model. And then there's the GPL and other reciprocal licenses, which essentially say if you make changes and you redistribute the changes, you redistribute a program based on this, you must give everybody the changes that you made. You must give everybody the full source code, and they have the same rights that you do. So essentially, for all the confusion, you can really think of most open source licenses as having these three possible, and that's kind of how we categorize them internally. Now, the interesting thing is all of the licenses, the thing that triggers the licenses that have requirements is redistribution. So you can take any of these licenses, if you're simply using them internally to your own company, you can take them in, you can make whatever changes you like, and you don't have to give anything to anybody. You can take, GCC, create a completely proprietary fork of it, keep it internally, so long as you never redistribute that to your customers or part of a product, you can make private modifications. So that's extremely useful, and obviously is something that Google takes a great deal of advantage of. So essentially, you don't have to give things back if you don't redistribute. Yes, question. Can you go to the mic? Is that possible?
So you said, as an example, GCC. Mm-hmm. If you create a completely proprietary fork of it, and then use it to make binaries of your program,
yes,
and distribute those binaries,
yes,
what happens?
So the question is, if you make a proprietary fork and you build binaries with that, can you then redistribute those? You make proprietary binaries, can you then redistribute them? Yes, you can.
Okay.
Yep, that's completely allowed by the license. That's not what Google does, by the way. Just in case you were worried. But yes, there have been occasions where people have done that, and that's actually perfectly allowable by the license. GCC actually is one of the projects that we give back a lot to. So let me just work out where I am on the notes. Yes, so keyed on distribution. So why do people do this? I mean, this is an interesting question. Why do people create these things that other people are getting immense value from? So the Boston Consulting Group and the Open Source Developer Network that's run by Andover, a company in the US, they actually did a study. They asked the developers on SourceForge, which is the most popular site for giving away free and open source software, and they asked them the question, why do you do this? What do you get out of it? And it's very interesting, the replies that came back. The largest answer is actually, and I can completely understand this, because essentially I got into it for the same reasons. It's purely intellectual curiosity. It's fun. Doing this is fun. So, I mean, in many ways, I have the best job in the world, because I get paid to do what I used to do on weekends and evenings for a hobby, which is very nice. Skills improvement is some of it. It's always nice to get better at what you do. Personally, I started working on Samba because I needed it at work. I needed something that did what Samba did. But I soon got dragged into the rat hole of improving it on evenings and weekends because it was fun to do. There's a lot of idealism and getting status, essentially raising your profile within the community by doing this work. One of the very interesting things is that a very low number is because people dislike proprietary software. I mean, I've worked for proprietary software vendors. I do work for a proprietary software vendor. I don't dislike proprietary software. I don't hate it. I've written it in the past. And if I couldn't do open source work, I would write it again. It's that I actually prefer to do open source work because it's more fun, it's more stimulating, it's collaborating with a lot more people. So, essentially, this is the open source developers are adults slide. People say, oh, you terrible corporations, you take this open source code and you exploit the poor developers. Well, the developers are adults. They know what they're doing. They choose licenses for a reason. They choose them with specific intents. If they want to do commercial proprietary software, they do commercial proprietary software. If you choose the BSD or MIT license, you know that you are giving your stuff away, and you don't complain about it. Well, except for the odd occasion like Theo Durat complaining that nobody gave him any money for OpenSSH. But you always get a few people complaining. That always kind of amuses me because I personally don't write software under that license, so it always seems to me like somebody complaining that, hey, I stood on the street corner with all my possessions with a sign saying, free, please everyone take, and I ended up naked and homeless. What happened? So I don't think you can really complain about that. The vast majority of people expect nothing back for the work other than actually the fun of making what it is that they're doing. And essentially, if you want to keep more control of your open source software, you use the reciprocal licenses like the GNU GPL. So, essentially, Google takes the open source software and uses it to build the Google infrastructure that everybody gets to use. So, we use the Linux kernel. We obviously use many of the open source system management tools. Everything in Google is really built around open source software. There's a Google version of Linux, Ubuntu, which a lot of people sort of have suspicions about, saying, oh, you have this proprietary fork of Linux. And essentially, all it is an internally supported version of Ubuntu. It's kind of, in some ways, that actually kind of sucks, because it's behind the external version of Ubuntu in many ways, which is why I'm running the external version of Ubuntu on this laptop, because it handles the wireless, whereas Ubuntu didn't. But it's the version that the engineering support staff actually are happy and comfortable supporting and pushing out on the production machines, essentially. And we like people to run Ubuntu because we're eating our own dog food. That's the software that we're going to be running on the production machines, for instance. The languages and compilers, GCC, many people are running Linux, and there's a repository within Google where all the code lives, and all incoming open source software is tracked in there, the license requirements are evaluated, and everything is completely and extremely well controlled. There's a really good process around importing software into that repository. We've actually given talks specifically and just on that process to commercial companies to teach them how Google does this, because it's done so well. One of the interesting and nice things is that if an imported piece of software, it actually has to go through essentially a build process to be imported. And if any of the checklists on that build process fail, then essentially the people who are using that software as part of their build fails. And they don't get binaries out until they've corrected whatever license problems or whatever they've run into. So it's extremely well done. So why do we do this? Why not, do Google OS? Well, because doing Google OS isn't Google's business. Google's business is organizing the world's information and making it universally accessible and useful, not writing an operating system. And so taking an open source operating system and making it do that is a far more efficient use of the resources that we have. So the other thing, and I can't stress this enough, the other thing that it does for us is it gives us complete independence from other people's schedules, other people's release schedules, other people's licenses. Anything that goes wrong on the Google production system, Google has the source code to go in and fix it. and has the engineering talent to do so. And if it's a piece of open source software and it gets fixed, we give that software back. And I'll talk about that process in a little bit. So if Google wants to do something different from everybody else, we have the ability to do that. We're not beholden to any third-party software vendor to make the changes that we need to do in order to make the code work. And that's extremely powerful. And it appeals essentially to the Google ethic, which is to try and give back and try and work with the community rather than build proprietary things ourselves. So, let's see. So, theoretically, I could finish the talk here. I mean, just by using the stuff, even making internal changes, we comply with all the licenses. This could be a talk on how to build a great business by using other people's open source software, right? And I could just finish here. But that wouldn't be as much of a fun place to work. I wouldn't want to work with a company that did that. They would essentially be seen as people who take rather than give back. And so this is why I'm in the open source program office, and this is why I like talking about this stuff. So what I'm going to talk about now is how Google gives back and what we do and why we do it. And it's extremely well thought out. So we do a lot of things in the open source program office, but most of what we do is basically we help the engineers do what they want to do and help them avoid any legal issues. So if somebody wants to open source a piece of code in Google, it's the most streamlined process I've ever seen. I've been in other open source review boards. I've sat on them. I've been the token engineer in a room full of lawyers, reviewing what somebody wants to do. Essentially, within Google, you send an email to the open source program office saying, I want to open source this piece of software. It does this. And we'll look over it. We'll make sure we'll give a recommendation on the license that they should use, but it is up to them. We'll make sure there's no issues with using other people's code or whatever. And mostly, we don't talk to legal. We just say, okay, go ahead. Because people like Chris, myself, Greg, essentially we've been doing this long enough that we know what works and what doesn't and what you can and can't do. So there's just a lot of experience in Google in actually looking at these kind of requests, and it's really streamlined. So a lot of the Google stuff gets released really, really quickly with essentially just an email to legal saying, we're doing this. Note that it's not an email to legal saying, we would like to do this. It's an email saying, we're doing this. And they don't have to respond unless they really blow up for some reason we don't know about. So we do a lot of code release, and we submit a lot of the changes that Google uses internally back out to the open source community. Google has a lot of money, in case you might have not have noticed. So one of the things that we do is give donations to various projects. Now, that actually is less useful than you might think. So I was at a party once in the middle of the dot-com boom in the heyday, and I ran into Larry Augustin, who was my boss at VA Linux, and Linus Torvalds, and they came up to me and they said, we want to give you guys $25,000 as the open source, as the Linus Torvalds Award. And to be honest, I went, please don't do this, because, well, we'd have to deal with tax. We have nowhere to put the money. The Samba team doesn't even have a bank account. You're going to make us set all this crap up. And I said, what we really need is people who can write code. And they said, well, we've got to give it to somebody, and it's your turn this year. So this is why, actually, the Samba team has a formal existence, because of that bloody $25,000 donation that we didn't want. So we had to set up a bank account. We had to deal with taxes. This ate probably months of time that we could have spent coding. Anyway, so money is less useful than you might think. So we do internal license discipline, as I've mentioned. We advise on APIs and protocols, participate in giving talks in places like this. Summer of Code. So Summer of Code is the wonder, is the really new innovation that Google has, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. And we also participate in the One Laptop Per Child project. So code release. About 1 million lines of code. More is coming all the time. As you may have noticed, Google Gears was released today. I didn't know about that one, actually, because there's lots of code that just gets released without everyone having to know about it. That looks actually a really cool thing. I was surfing the web and looking at how that works during some of the afternoon. There's a lot of the MySQL replication stuff that's come out. Essentially, a lot of the internal tools that we use. A version of Fuse, the file system as user space, has been ported to Mac. Let's see, TC-malloc, a bunch of large-scale performance tools that Google uses internally have been made available. One of the reasons for doing this is it's really helpful to have these technologies out there that people use, so that, because Google does a lot of hiring from the open source community, so that when people come into Google, they already know some of the things that they're going to be using and working on. So that's very, very handy. The other thing we do is provide project hosting, and this actually is a submarine way of reducing license proliferation. So SourceForge is the largest project hosting site. Code.google.com is second, and that's absolutely fine. We're not trying to make this, the world's biggest or best code hosting site. One of the nice things we do with the project hosting is that we restrict the number of licenses that you can choose when you're creating a project. So you can't sort of come up with, Jeremy's license of the day and say, oh, it's an open source license and I'm using this. You have to choose a restricted set of licenses. So all of the projects under there have a known set of licenses that, we already know that we can deal with. And it does all the things that you would expect, like, version control, source code control, wikis, all this kind of things. Many, many thousands of projects on there. I have no clue what they all are. And of course, the open source tools that we use internally and the open source projects that are created internally, we give the code back and we keep it up to date. And this is important. And the reason, this is enlightened self-interest, because in keeping these projects up to date and giving the patches away, what this means is that Google doesn't have to maintain a separate fork, a separate branch of these projects. Obviously, we try and work with the project leaders and the project managers to get the patches accepted. Hiring Andrew Morton was one of the main goals for doing that with Linux, to get the Google changes for Linux back out into the community, so that essentially we don't have to maintain such a private version of Linux. One of the main changes that was made in the Google Linux for a while was essentially backports of 2.6 features to 2.4. So this is one of the things that didn't really get released, and people grumbled about that a little bit. But essentially, if we're trying to phase those machines out, and machines running 2.6 already have those changes. So as you can see, there's just a whole host of different projects. Like the person asked about GCC. Yes, we contribute a lot back to that. Obviously, I write when I'm not on the road giving talks, I write lots of code for Samba. So let's see. Oh, this is embarrassing. As I said, they're my boss's slides, so he's put me on here. So there's Andrew, Guido, Greg, and myself listed as named open source developers. But essentially, we're obviously hoping to expand that as much as possible. And coming on board, essentially, I can just speak for myself on this. The goal was keep running the project, keep contributing to the project. Don't, sort of come into Google and disappear. Keep maintaining an external profile. Keep working on the code. Keep making it work for everybody, as well as for Google internally. So it's a very good place to do open source code. So let's get to the summer of code. So the summer of code came about because, Chris, essentially, he's been around in the open source community a very long time. He knows that throwing money at projects essentially doesn't really work. I mean, there's some fuss in Debian at the moment from trying to have some funded developers, and other people are objecting to this. So just giving a project money can often do more harm than good. What projects really need is good code. So how do you get good code? Well, idle students. Idle students are perfect targets for creating code. They got nothing better to do during the summer. There's a wonderful quote somewhere on these slides saying, "Get them flipping bits, not burgers," as their summer job. So the way this works is essentially projects come to Google with, here are a bunch of things that we would like people to do. Students apply for that or come up with their own projects. Google essentially filters them, comes down, you have to have mentors. It basically gets boiled down. So Summer of Code 2006 had about 600 students in 90 different countries, all creating open source software. And one of the other things that we're doing with Summer of Code is, as we're getting these students to create the code, we're making them members of the open source community. So, for example, the last person that we recently made a member of the Samba team, we discovered, came across, and started working with us through Summer of Code. So it's a way for projects to get new talent coming in, open source projects to get new talent coming in and helping. Yes?
How many students are actually applying for positions in Summer of Code? I thought that would be more. I thought there would be more students than 630.
So the question was, how many students are applying for Summer of Code this year?
How many students are applying, out of whom those 630 are accepted?
Hang on a second. I think those numbers might have been on the previous slide. Let's see. Yes, so as you can see there, that was for 2006. So there were 3,044 applicants, and we ended up funding 630.
Okay.
So, yeah, I mean, it's not like you apply and you automatically get accepted, because we're going to pay you money. So, you have to, basically the mentors have to approve what it is you're going to do, and there's only a limited number of places. But it's actually gone up this year. I think it's gone up from 600 to about 900 this year. But the numbers are on a later slide.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So how does it work? So a student applies to work on, let's say, Apache, and the Apache Software Foundation reviews the application, decides to accept the student. There's only a certain number of places, obviously, because there's a limited pool of cash. So we pay them for being accepted. They create a project with the mentor. Halfway through, they get $2,000. When they finish, and if they've completed the goals that they set down, and it's also the goal, the job of the mentors to make sure that the students don't sort of go crazy, like, okay, we're going to write a complete new SQL server that will take on Oracle. You have to help them set realistic goals that they can actually achieve, and they get another $2,000. So it's reasonably significant. And of course, you get a T-shirt at the end of it, which is extremely valuable. We learned in Samba that you can make people do almost anything for a limited edition T-shirt. So we sell T-shirts with Samba written on it, but you have to be a member of the Samba team to have the Samba team T-shirt. And that's actually the only benefit you get from being on the Samba team, is you get the T-shirt that says team on it. But people give us thousands of hours of coding work to get that T-shirt. So, hey, it works. It certainly works. And obviously you get very valuable experience along, and probably a certificate too, yes. So here's the geographic breakdown for 2006. So the US is the largest. I don't know whether that's because they have more computing science students, probably just larger population, more active internet access. Interestingly enough, Germany is a very, very large free software hotbed. Go, Germany! And there's a lot of students coming from here, which is very, very good. And then as it tails off, I think mostly it's to do with lack of internet access, lack of opportunities. So the educational distribution, as you might expect, you get more undergrads than PhD students, mainly because the undergrads have more time and are bored during the summer. But you do get some people with advanced degrees coming on and working on this, because, hey, they must be poor too. And the other thing that I found really interesting, I didn't know this before joining Google, is that it's not just computing science students who apply and get accepted and actually do work. There are people in, English literature who are actually decided they want to write code as a hobby or something, and they get accepted and become, in all these various different disciplines, they become successful in the summer of code. And we turn them into free software developers. Ha-ha. It's our evil plan. So why do we do this? So, as I said, here's the wonderful quote. Flip bits, not burgers. And, it is enlightened self-interest on Google's part, because Google is not just a consumer, but a producer of open source software. And the more open we can keep things, the more open we can keep the internet. Essentially, the more people are writing code out there that run over the internet and essentially are just creating more open standards is good for Google. Not only are there people that we want to work with, there are people that we hire, and essentially growing the developer base grows the internet and essentially grows the economic activity for everybody. So it's actually very, very good for Google. It's a great way for us to get contacts with educational establishments, because Google isn't that big in terms of people. So it's a great way to actually get contacts with universities that we wouldn't otherwise get to talk to, and maybe get to talk to them about some of the computing science curriculum that they're doing. There's actually my office mate is very involved in educational uses. He's actually trying to find spare Google machines to create clusters for university students to practice some real large-scale coding on. I won't mention any more about that. He's doing the PR on that. And it's a great way for open source organizations to actually get new members, get new blood coming in, writing new code. I mean, as I said, Samba has benefited enormously from this. Many, many other organizations have. Of course, some students fail, some organizations fail to mentor. So, there's some filtering going on at Google. We have people who track the metrics on what everybody has done and how everybody's doing. And so, some organizations don't get accepted, some organizations do. It depends how they've done, depends what kind of projects they want to do. And as I said, we hire a lot from the open source world. So here's actually the 2007 distribution of the S. I don't know if you can see that. The S are for students and the M are for mentors. I think our new Samba-Team guy's on here somewhere. Hey, is anyone in this room on here? Anyone? No? Cool. Oh, well, if you live in Germany, then you're on here, because this is one of the Google Maps thingies. There should have been green lines showing between mentors and students, but I couldn't work out how to do that. But hey, you're probably on there, so this is very cool. So as you can see, it's spread over. This is an interesting thing to look at. If you've got Google Earth, there's the URL. Well, I don't know whether these slides are going to be available, but if you load that URL into Google Earth, you will essentially see all the people who are participating, mentors and students in Summer of Code this year, spread around the globe. So you can look at it to your heart's content. So as I said, we've got 900 or so students, 130 organizations, and there was 6,000 applications. And, coding started about 2 or 3 days ago, so I will expect our first check-in soon. So it's extremely useful. This, I think, is probably the thing I'm most proud of. I mean, Google engineers do a lot and give a lot back, but Summer of Code is something absolutely unique that Google does, that we created, that is really, really cool. I don't know anyone else who's actually growing the open source ecosystem in this way. And it's one of the reasons I'm really proud to work here. So I think that's the end of the presentation, yes. So does anyone have any questions or comments? And remember, if you do, please use the microphone. And so we're just about on time. Any questions, comments, complaints? All right, well, thank you very much.